All right, so we're picking back up here. We just finished completing basically this little exercise, which is to create a real basic web page, get it up in the browser. Did a little bit of file management, learned about the core tags for HTML. Now we're going to start learning about some of the other real basic tags in HTML. We're going to start with what they call the heading element, which is coming up on the next slide here. Now, notice that the heading element actually has a number of different levels. And what they're showing you here is what the code looks like next to what the output looks like. So really, when you have an H1 heading level 1, it's the largest, and from there it dwindles on down to be the smallest. Now, what's interesting about this is I really, from a practical sense, I don't find much need to go down below an H3. In fact, I very rarely use anything, below H2, honestly. Usually H1s and H2s are all I use, because when it starts to get smaller, you'll see that it becomes less distinct and almost looks just like regular text. So, that's something you should know up front. But let's play at least a couple of these. In fact, let's do maybe the first 3 levels. So let's go back to our editor here. And I'm actually going to get rid of my hello world. And I'm going to put in an H1 tag. And let's just be clever and say hello, Racine. And then notice once again, closing tag, same tag, just prefaced with a /. And let's go ahead and do an H2 right away. Not to make Kenosha feel lonely. And then I'm going to continue here and do an H3. And since we have another major campus out in Elkhorn, may as well put that down there. And that's as far as I'm going to go. You want to do all 6, feel free. And right now, really what we're doing is we're trying things. So notice in Notepad++, the indicator that it's not saved is that this little icon here is red. Other programs will have like a little asterisk or something in there. But do a Control-S to save, or you can hit the save icon. And then if you still have your browser window open, and I might, well, apparently not, you could just do a refresh. But since that's not the case, I'm going to go ahead and go to the Run menu. I'm going to launch it in Chrome. And you can see the results. Now, you do not need to close this page now that it's up on the screen. In fact, what we're going to be doing is we'll make changes. We'll come back to the browser and refresh, and then take a look at the result. And you're going to see that's kind of a pattern that you get into. So I'm going to, as we get working into a workflow, I'll kind of show you some little techniques too for being able to switch windows really quickly and keystroke commands and things of that nature. Now, the other thing that you should do here, folks, is whenever you're looking at stuff in the browser, right-click anywhere on the open section of the page. Don't do it on top of the text because it'll give you actually a different menu. And then choose View Page Source. And depending on the browser that you're using, that might say different things. It might say View Source or something of that nature, but that will be the tool that you'll use, View Page Source. And then what you're looking at here is your HTML document that the browser received, and hopefully it looks exactly like what you typed. And that way you know that it's doing the commands that you issued. That I am going to close though, and this I'm going to leave right here up on the screen just like that. Right, let's jump back over to the PowerPoint, and the next tag that they're going to talk about is what we call the paragraph tag. This is another one of those really basic HTML structures. So I'm going to create a paragraph, and I'll say and as is implied by just the name paragraph, you're putting in a little bit more than just a heading. In fact, you might put in several lines of text, and what I'm going to do is I am going to put in several lines of text by just copy pasting what I just typed. But notice that all of that sits in between the opening and closing paragraph tag. Some people, when they're working with elements like this, like paragraphs, will opt to format it maybe even in this fashion, where they put the opening tag on separate lines. How you format this is completely up to you. The one thing that you should know is it will have no bearing on what comes out on the screen, which is a little bit weird, because we lay out these HTML documents and the code within them to look pleasant to our eyes. The computer doesn't care. It looks for opening and closing tags. It doesn't care about indenting or spacing or any of that stuff. So you do what looks comfortable to you. Now, well-written code, they say, should be nicely formatted and easy to read, but doesn't have to be technically. It's just easier to troubleshoot if it is, because you can see the problems a little bit faster. All right, so notice that I'm actually going to opt to not have that white space in there. My habit for doing paragraphs is to work like this. You want to work like that, that's fine. You don't have to. All right. The other thing we're going to do here now is we're going to hit Control S to save. So I'm giving you keystrokes. That's pretty standard in most software packages. I'm also holding down my Alt key and pressing my Tab key to switch between applications. That works on a Mac also if you're curious, but you use the Option key, the one right next to the keyboard or the space bar, and you can tab between your open applications. So I'm holding down the Alt key, and so really my intent is to go from here to here, right? Going from this one to that one, and I'm not using my mouse, see? Yeah, and then you can refresh your screen two different ways without the mouse, without going up here and hitting refresh. You can actually hold down the Control key and the letter R, Control R, or F5. Now, sometimes on laptops, the function keys don't give you a refresh because sometimes they're flipped to special functions like volume or screen brightness or something silly like that. So like on my laptop, I have to hold down my function key and then F5 and it'll refresh. So there's kind of a little bit of like a workflow thing there that I'm trying to show you, is that I came here, I made an edit, Control S to save, Alt Tab to switch back to the browser, Control R to refresh. Yeah, I do too. Now, one person noticed that, or had a question about how the words were wrapping. And if you notice here inside of Notepad++, my text that's in this paragraph really is all on one line. And the editor itself is set to do word wrap. So if you go to the view menu, excuse me, you can flip on word wrap, and most text editors have a setting for this. And if I didn't have that checked on, this line would just keep going all the way off to the right as far as it would go. All right. So word wrap is a thing you might want to turn on. Now, when it ends up in the browser, however, the browser automatically word wraps the paragraph text. It's not because I told it when I got to this version of this is so, go to the next line. I mean, all it takes is me changing the browser window and it wraps in a different spot. It does it automatically. There's no setting for it in the browser. The browser does whatever I tell it to do. In the text editor, that might all be on one line. And actually, this kind of leads to one of the things that we're going to talk about soon, which is how the browser treats white space in the document. You notice that here I type this space is space so cool, right, etc. And that space that I'm creating does show up on the screen, right? But only one. All right, and that's a little uncomfortable at first because when you're used to working in a text editor, you're like, well, I just need a couple spaces in there, so I'm going to do that. Okay, but if I save that, go back to my browser and refresh, it doesn't do a darn thing. Maybe it didn't really refresh. No, it refreshed. See? It ignores that white space. It will only read one space. Now the same thing happens if I'm here and I do this. So if it's ignoring a couple spaces, it also ignores all those carriage returns. That's not what's formatting the document. That's the point. So I'm going to save that, come back. Now notice I just refreshed my source code, so it did come in. But if I go to my page here, I can refresh to my heart's content, and I'll click on it so you can see it's not reading that white space. So the white space is ignored. It will only read one space. Anything beyond that will not be read. Okay, so that's a handy thing to know too. We control the layout and the formatting using HTML tags, not spaces. So now I'm like kind of undoing all that stuff I just did so that it goes back to where it should be. All right, let's move on to the next slide here and look at another element that's pretty important. And this is one of the rare self-closing tags out there, and this is a line break. So let's say I did want to do a separate line for each one of these. I can insert this BR tag right here. Notice where I put it, right after the first sentence, so I'm saving it, and then back to the browser, and then I'm going to do the refresh. So my line break was right here. See how it moved it down? But it did not move down here. Just moved everything down to the next line. Now I could mimic that structure here if I wanted, but that's not what's moving it to the next line. Me doing that is not moving it to the next line. So if I want to do a line break between each sentence, I can do that. So once again, I'm going to go back to the browser and refresh, and you can see. And then if I want to move it down 2 lines, I do 2 line breaks. And then a refresh. Now the thing that becomes interesting with this is if I were, let's say, to replicate these paragraphs, which I'm about to do, so I'm just copying that paragraph, and then down here I'm going to paste it back in. In fact, I'm going to do that a couple times, just so I have some text on my page. And in these subsequent revisions, I'm going to remove these extraneous line breaks. And then I want you to watch the behavior of the output. Can you identify where the paragraphs end? Well, the marker for them ending is really this little ASDF stuff. So notice that when this paragraph concludes, there's a space, there's actually an extra line break in between this paragraph and the one that follows. There's a built-in style for paragraphs, and there's a built-in style for headings. That's why the font is bigger and why there's all these space around the heading tags. A paragraph tag has basically the capacity where it creates the paragraph, but it does create a space above and below. It enforces that. So, in other words, this is one complete paragraph. It will have a space above it. It will have a space below it. And the same is true with this paragraph. The other thing that's important to note is you're going to start learning about what we call block level items. So anything that's within a tag that's a block level item, and an H1, H2, H3, those are all block level, and paragraph are all block level, occupy the whole width of whatever element is containing it. You know, that's kind of a mouthful. But in other words, the element that is containing my H1, H2, H3, and my paragraphs is the body tag. The body tag fills the whole window that contains all the visible elements. When I put a paragraph in, regardless of how many words are in the paragraph or where I put line breaks, it occupies that entire space of the screen from side to side that that parent element contains. So that paragraph fits inside the body. The body occupies the full width of the screen. The paragraph now occupies the full width of the screen. If the containing element only occupied part of the screen, it could only go across that one part. We'll learn that later. But this is just to help you kind of learn some of this basic terminology that we're going to keep ramping up on. All right, here's an interesting element called block quote. And a block quote really is a replication of what we see in printed material. You guys ever have to write a paper in a class, and then all of a sudden you came up with a quote, a direct quote from somebody, and then there's a rule in English that if your quote exceeds 4 lines, then you should block quote it. In a block quote in text is where you indent it in both margins, and usually you put double quotes around it, but that indicates that it's a longer quote. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking that tag, I changed my middle paragraph to a block quote tag, so you see opening block quote, closing block quote. I'm going to save my document, and then let's take a look at the result here when I refresh. So notice how this one now is indented from the left and from the right. It's pushed in on both ends. That can be kind of useful. And once again, this is kind of meant to replicate the kind of stuff that we would do in printed material. All right, let's learn some of these, what the author is calling phrase elements, but these are these helpful little tags. And unlike the paragraph tag and the heading tags, these are all inline tags. In other words, if I apply these tags, whatever I apply it to does not fill the whole width of the containing space. It will just affect whatever is encapsulated within it. So for example, we'll do each one of these. Let's do bold. So I'm going to take the word cool in the first paragraph and put the letter B in front of it, and then close that right after. And notice it's just around that word. So I'm going to save that, and then when I go back to the browser and refresh, you can see how the word cool became bold. In much the same fashion, I can use the italics tag, it's just the letter I, and then let's do a refresh again, and notice how I took the word web and italicized it. And I don't know if this would be helpful for you guys. Maybe, I should have thought of this earlier, is I should probably split screen it like this. This might be helpful for you. All right, so the bold tag and the italic tag. Now, what's interesting about these two tags is this is old school HTML. Remember that weird word processor I was telling you about? That's kind of how it did it. And in old, HTML 1, 2, and I think all the way up to 4, this was considered the best way to do bold and italics. And then when XHTML came out, they said, well, that's absolutely silly. You should really do it with CSS. And instead of using bold and italics, you should use these other two tags. And let me show you what two tags they came up with. Instead of making things bold, really what you're trying to say is this thing has strong meaning. So we're going to use the strong tag. Now what's important here is that we are applying what we're going to call semantic meaning to what we're marking up. So what we're trying to say is the word cool is important. So it has strength. In terms of the output in the browser, it does exactly the same thing that bold does. And they also came up with a different way to do italics, thinking that italics indicates emphasis, so we use an M tag. And once again, I put it around the word web. So I saved it, now I'm coming back and reloading it. So functionally, in terms of appearance on the page, bold works like strong, and italics works like M, or emphasis. Now, one is intended to be a styling element, and one is intended to have semantic meaning. So the clarity of what I'm saying to you probably won't resonate quite yet, but when we start to talk about the semantic web and what that means, HTML5 is all about the meaning of the tags, much more so than previous versions. So bold tags should be seen as more of like a quick and easy way to style something. But if you really want to apply special meaning to something in terms of what the browser is reading, strong and M are considered better choices. No, they're not CSS. They're kind of in lieu of CSS. CSS is a whole separate language. All right, let's try some of these other ones. Look at what this one does. Mark actually highlights something. This is not one I use commonly, but no reason why we can't play with it. So I'm opening it there, and closing it here. Save it. And this time I'm doing a right-click reload. That's kind of neat. I really don't see a lot of use for that personally, and I don't really use it much, but it's there, okay, because maybe you just want to simulate a highlighter, and that's one way to do it. There's CSS ways to do that as well. Once again, notice, though, that semantic meaning. We're marking up the text and doing like a highlight. So we're telling the browser, hey, we marked this. Okay, so that's what you should keep in mind here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this PowerPoint off to the side. The other one that they want us to try is one called small. Guess what that does? Yeah, it makes it bigger. No, yeah. It shrinks the text a little bit. Can you see where it's shrunk? Where do we mark that I can create small? I don't see it getting smaller, do you? Everybody getting the same effect? No, mine's not getting smaller. Yours got smaller? What browsers are you using? Firefox? And that's the thing you guys are going to learn here too, is different browsers can give different results. Let's take a look in Firefox and see what happens. Did it get small? I think I have a problem with my code, honestly. When I see that I'm doing something and it's not having an effect, that's indicative of some sort of a problem. Now, I'm looking at my code, frankly, and I'm not seeing the problem. I know some of you have coded before, so are you seeing a problem? Right here. If you want to make sure that you can see it, you could, make it. Yeah, yours got smaller. Why didn't mine get smaller? Because it's a trick? Is that what you said? Yeah. I have been known to try to trick people, yes. Usually to prove a point. But I'm just wondering if it actually saved. So here I am like, well, it looks like it's saved. All right. So we should trust that it's saved. Now I have it open in Firefox. Let's refresh. It's not getting smaller. That's smaller? Is it? All right, it's smaller uppercase. Well, let's make it say the same thing as the next snippet of text. It is smaller. It's just really hard. It is really hard to see. But if you really zoom in on it, you can see the size difference. And not only that, there's other levels of using that small tag, and it's not one I'm a big fan of, but there's small, extra small, large, extra large. And the way that you do that is, if I remember right, you do this. And I'm testing it here. I'm trying to go from memory here, so if it fails brilliantly, you guys can laugh at me. Well, apparently that's wrong. Maybe it's just like this. Google it. Don't take my word for it. Google it. And you know where you would look for that information? This is a good learning moment, actually. And I bet you that is probably deprecated, but the place that you should go is W3 Schools. Are you guys seeing this? W3 Schools is down. Okay, back. And then I'm just going to do a search here. And see if they have, yeah, they don't even list. So maybe the extra small stuff got deprecated out. But I know that there's been a lot of contention with some of the way that they have named some of this stuff. So when they go to like future iterations, it'll be interesting to see which tags stick and which don't. If you're interested also in doing subscripts and superscripts, you see I'm putting in a number here. You can do a sub, and I'll do both of them at the same time. That's a subscript. And if you want to do a superscript, now, I know a lot of this stuff might not be handy for some of the work that you're going to do, but some of it might be quite handy. So you can see how this adjusted the positions, and really when you go back to like 100% zoom, I think you really get the better effect of this, because there's 100%, so you can see the subscript and the superscript a little bit better. But very often those will be used in conjunction with small. So for example, people will do both small and sub. You can see it got a little bit smaller. It's kind of hard to tell, but it does get a little bit smaller. So you want to be careful about how you implement those, but those are just to try. The other thing that I'm really demonstrating here is a thing called nesting, and that's actually our next slide, which I'm going to pull back onto the main screen here. The point of nesting is that when you start a tag in a particular spot, you need to make sure you close it within the same spot. And I'm trying to use kind of generic terms here. So what they're showing as an example is, first they start by creating a paragraph. The paragraph closes here. If I then decide to make some italic text, notice that that is directly inside the paragraph. It needs to close inside that paragraph. And then part of the way through the text, I decide to make some of the text strong. That needs to close before the italics is closed. If I took this italics and put that here, that would be considered not properly nested. So it's important to keep things nested because it's part of the rule set for HTML, and that is the kind of thing that will start to break code when your pages get complicated. Nesting at this level, if I don't do it right, chances are it'll still look the same. I start to throw CSS into the mix and JavaScript, things will break in a terrible fashion. And the reason is not properly nested. Right, another HTML construct here are list elements, and there's a few different ones, and we're going to do them one at a time, but these are the three basic categories: unordered, ordered, and description. And we'll start with unordered. So you can see unordered The basic tag for it is UL, unordered list. And then for items inside the list, we use LI, which is list item. What that will generate is output that looks like this. So a generic looking bullet for a list of items. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create an area here on the page. So I'm going to start with UL. I'm going to close my UL. The UL itself, per se, does not really contain any text typically. That's reserved for the list items inside of it. So once again, opening and closing tags. And it's not fun unless you have a few of them. So let's get at least a couple of them pasted in there. Very often, lists are used for navigation. I just like throwing stuff out there. All right. So you see the structure here, opening and closing UL tags. Inside there, opening and closing list items with text in between. I'm going to split screen myself here again so we can see the output, and I'm going to do a refresh now. Oops, I got to save it first. See the red icon? And then I'm going to do a refresh, and you can see the unordered list. Notice that it also has a little bit of styling to it. All right, the next one we're going to look at, that's the one we just did, is ordered lists. Same basic thing, but in this case, we are using the OL tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this whole structure. I'm going to drop it in down here somewhere. And then I'm going to change that UL to an OL, not 0, O. And then I'm going to make the same change here. And it's probably good to put other stuff in here. Isn't that how it went this year? Something like that. And then if I save that, and once again back to the browser and refresh, and you see that's going to end up at the bottom. But see what an ordered list does? It's the same type of basic indenting, but it numbers things instead. And yes, to follow up with the previous question, can you change the style of your bullets? Absolutely. You can also change the numbers. You can change it to letters, Roman numerals, uppercase, lowercase, and a bunch of other different things. And that's all controllable through CSS. But this is the basic format where it does number it like this. All right, we're going to move on to description list now. And description list is a little bit different. In description lists, and if you notice in the first slide when you talked about lists, how it used to be called definition list, because the intent was really for you to create like keywords and then write a definition for them, like in a dictionary. But they changed the name to description list, and I think it actually fits a little bit better. But instead of having basically two elements, where we have like the parent element and then list elements inside, or list items, here we have three different elements. One is the DL, which contains the whole thing. And then we're going to have a title, or the term, I guess is what they're calling it here. I always think of it as title, but DT. So it's like the term that we would think of defining. And then the DD, which will hold the actual information. Now this one, even if you've worked with HTML before, maybe you haven't learned this one, but this is actually a pretty cool one because it allows you to do like list-like stuff, but it eliminates the numbers and eliminates the bullets. So it kind of creates kind of a neat effect. So if you look at the structure that they're using here on the next slide, DL encapsulates everything. Then we do a DT, and after DT we do a DD. That's the format that they would like you to use. So I'm going to go ahead and type that code in, and I'll do that right here. So I'll create my DL, I'll close my DL, and then I'm going to create a DT. Close that. And then to match that DT, I'm going to do a DD. And then once again, I'm going to repeat that structure, so I'm going to copy those two lines. That's a joke. Okay, guys. I'll know how old you are if you laugh at it. Some people will choose, when they're working with the DT and the DDs, that they actually indent those. Some people see them as kind of like subservient to the DTs. That's up to you how you do the formatting, remember. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this and then go back to our page here and refresh. And you can see at the bottom what it does. So it still creates a list, it creates a structure, and it creates some formatting. So this can be a pretty useful thing as well. Now, keep in mind here, I put in very brief little things inside the DD tags, but you could put something much more significant in there. But it does create an interesting little structure. John? Yep, and the question that I just had here in class was, can I put a DL inside this DL? Yes. Can you put a UL or OL inside of one of those? Yes. You can nest them many layers deep. In fact, one technique that we see for like creating like menus, some people will use unordered lists, for example. And then if they wanted like a sub-menu for about, they would do something like this. Right, and create the closing UL, and then start putting list items inside there. So that would be just an example. And frankly, there's not really a whole lot of rules about how you do that. As long as everything is encapsulated properly, there's no reason why it shouldn't work. You just got to make sure you put the entire structure inside one element so that it's nested properly, and then it should function okay. I don't see a lot of reason for doing that, but like what you said as an example, like if you were like doing like a simulation of an outline for note taking, that would be one way you could accomplish it. Now, the other thing you should keep in mind, though, is some of those effects can also be achieved by just using CSS, and a lot of people would probably opt for that. So it really kind of depends on your intent. The structure that you see here, these are all the default styles that HTML creates automatically. We're not applying any styles to it. This is just what HTML does. Styling will come later when we get to CSS, though. We'll learn quite a bit about it. All right, so that was definition lists, and I guess we cleared another hurdle here. All right, so now we're on slide 25 here, and I think we will take a quick break here in class before we move on to this, and then we'll carry on. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. This one covers special characters. Now, this is kind of interesting because when you're working in this environment, you might think that you're limited to generating only the characters that are available on the keyboard, but the truth is there's a complete set of special characters that you can invoke using a certain type of a special key code. And now they have a really very primitive list here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us out to W3 Schools, and let's actually use Firefox for that since it's already open. And I'm just going to type special characters. And you see here they call them symbols. So you'll hear both forms. And then notice that W3 does a really nice job of giving you a much more complete list and showing you things in certain categories. So for example, if you were wondering, how do they get that symbol for sum if you're doing like a calculus equation? That character exists in the key code sets, but how do you get it up on the screen? I mean, there's no button you can press. Maybe if you press like Shift, Alt, Control, stand on your head and juggle 3 balls at the same time, you can get it. But if you look at really carefully at the list, there's basically 2 forms of doing special characters: the old school way and the new school way. The one that has the number column, that indicates the actual character key code that was generated that would trigger that key in the character set that we see. But who is going to sit there and remember, this? Oh, that was ampersand pound 8721 semicolon, right? And so what they did, like we saw in the slide, is they developed shortcut methods for a lot of the common ones. So for example, if you were to do a copyright symbol, you just do and copy. But if you looked on this page for that, so I'm doing a little web page search here. I can get there it is. It says 3 matches. So this is Firefox, so it puts this in the wrong spot, puts it at the bottom of the screen. I was looking for it at the top. But notice that the actual character number code for it is #169. I don't remember that. It's so much easier since they came out with these like names that represent essentially the same thing. So the ones that you'll see most often, or often, will be the ones that they already have listed on the slide. But I do want you to be aware of the fact that there are many, and this actually is the complete reference here. So if you take a look at the codes and the stuff that you can generate, some of it is pretty weird. But if you ever go to a web page and you're like, how did they do that? That actually is text. It's not character, looking at the little emojis and your horoscope. I'm a Gemini, whatever. Musical notes. But you get an idea of what's available out there. So there's always these special character codes that you can use. The ones that we're going to play with are ones that are pretty common. And the ones that are kind of interesting here, and maybe you've already thought this, right? Did you ever go to a web page that shows you HTML code? It's like, wait a second, if they're using that character, how are they putting it up on screen without it becoming a paragraph? You know what I mean? So they actually have to use the special character code for greater than or less than to put that up on the screen in order for it to be visible. The other one that people recommend that you use is one for an ampersand. And I'm going to try all of these on the page. And then one that puts in a space. And that one's actually called non-breaking space. And that's one that you might actually utilize a bit. Let's go ahead and bring our editor back up. And I'm just going to find a spot here. I'll do it actually right at the top here. Remember when I was typing in all those spaces and they wouldn't stick? If you do want spaces that stick, you can use a non-breaking space. So if I do ampersand NBSP semicolon, and every time I add that in, it will force a space. Now, one space isn't very dramatic, but if I want, let's say 5 spaces, I just pasted it in 5 times. And let's bring up the browser and refresh. And now you can see that I am getting the spaces to show up. So that's a non-breaking space. The other one that I think is cool that you might find some use for is that copyright thing. So what you might want to do on your page somewhere is you might actually create like a paragraph and just say, and copy, semicolon. What is the year? Already? Jeez. All right. All right, so you can see what I did, and I should keep to my rules and make sure I close my paragraph. See what happens when you don't open it and close it right away? You almost leave it open. And so what's going to happen here is I'm going to save that, come back here and refresh, and then scroll down. And you can see little copyright logo. Simple but effective. And that's one that you might want to put on your page. If you want to protect any of the contents on the page, you might say something like copyright, the year. You might include your name or your company's name and say all rights reserved for all original content. Don't use without permission, that kind of thing. That's an excellent question. And the question here was, are there circumstances where, just say for example, I mistakenly didn't put the semicolon in. I'm going to save it, and I'll come back here and refresh. You see it didn't change the page. But right now we're dealing with real basic HTML. So what it's doing is it's saying, that's what he meant. That's what it's doing, literally. But when we start to add more complex structures in here, that semicolon is absolutely critical. So with basic HTML, it will do what they call quirks mode, where it tries to interpret what you meant. And that's the danger of HTML when you're first learning, because you think you learned it correctly, but you want to use the rule set. And one of the last things we're going to do tonight before we go is we're going to look at validation, so you guys can learn how to start validating your code. All right, let's move on to the next thing. And then you can play with these to your heart's content or any of the other ones out there. But I'm going to teach you your first generic element. And the div is a block level element. Once again, it's one of those that's going to occupy the full width of the screen within whatever object is containing it. But unlike a paragraph or any of the other structures that we learned, it does not have any pre-built styles, and there is no meaning attached to it. It's just a generic block level holder. So I'm creating a div, and I'm going to find myself a piece of text. Let's find something on the internet that I can paste in. So I'm just going to go to like a news site, pull in some news. Okay, what story looks interesting to us here? How about this one? You guys should go to Montreal. So what I'm doing, folks, is I'm just copying some text, so I have some text to work with. All right. And I'm just going to paste that inside the div. All right, I know it's like a big blob of text. Notice that I pasted it in, and it did read all these separate paragraphs and pasted them into separate lines. But despite the fact that there's all this white space here, or line breaks, let's watch how that renders on the page. So back to the browser and a refresh. So this is the text I just added. Notice those line breaks are gone. Treats it all as one block of text. The other thing that you would notice as well is that a div has no predefined styles and no predefined meaning. So it will not do anything aside from just sit there. So, and this is one thing you should understand too. I'm going to take this div, I'm going to paste it in a couple more times. I'm going to end up removing it, but I'm basically stacking 3 of them, and then, oops, and then I'm going to come over here and do a refresh. And notice now I have all 3 of those kind of like one after the other. But do you notice there's no spacing between them like a paragraph would give you? Divs don't have that built into them. They're just all stuck together. I got 3 divs pasted back to back, there's no spacing between them. Now, I don't want all that text in my document, so I'm going to hopefully remove those other two divs, and it looks like I did. All right, and then come back over here. Let's save, and back over here and refresh. And that's a div. Now, where divs get useful, folks, and the reason they're showing this to us so early in the book is because very often divs are used as structural elements where we don't have other tools to help define those elements. So for example, when we are working with an HTML5 document, HTML5, when they were developing it, the developers looked at it and said, you know, when we're building pages with HTML4 and XHTML, we very often create the pages in a pattern. And I kind of chose this news site not by accident either. So, you know, I used the BBC website, and if you look at their website, and actually I'll go full screen with this, notice that they kind of follow the format that's shown in that document in some ways. So for example, they have a top section where there's navigation, and there's a header and a logo, and then there's kind of like a content area. And in this case, they don't have like 3 boxes going across, they only have a couple. But I think on their main page, if I go back, it was a little bit more like that, where they have like multiple little boxes, right? And then way at the bottom, they'll have like a footer section. This is a very long page where they put other information. So if you keep that in mind as you look at this, this is not an atypical structure for a website. And so very often what we would do in the old days is we would create divs for each one of these sections. So I would create a div, and then I would give it a name of header. So let me just give you an example of what I mean by that. So I would create a div, and the way I would give it a name is I would just give it an ID, and I would call it header. And I'm not keeping this here, so don't type this in. But that's how we would identify it as a different thing. So what happened over the years is everybody got into this habit of when they're creating their code that they always create a top part because that's where the logo goes, and that's where I put my social icons up there, that kind of thing. And I always create a div, and I always give it an ID, a header. Well, then I do my navigation, so I create another div, and I always give it an ID of navigation, or nav, right? So that structure became very common, and people very often would give IDs to those things, name that. So somebody said, well, why don't we just create a tag called header? And why don't we just create a tag called nav and main and footer? And that's exactly what they did in HTML. Now, not that there's not a use for divs anymore, there still is. But really, because they're generic, there's no predefined meaning. The reason that we came up with these is a header means something. A footer means something. Stylistically, it does not do anything more than a div does, but it has meaning attached to it. And that's a really important concept in HTML5, is that you know, the meaning that goes with the tag and what it does to the page. So a well-structured page, and this is important to know, a well-structured page that uses the HTML5 tags that have meaning means more to search engines like Google when they're looking for stuff. Oh, this is the navigation. It says so right here, right? There's no searching for it. It figures it out. Whereas if I created a div, I might not be clever and call my navigation section navigation. I might call it like div 2, you know, because it means something to me, but it doesn't mean anything to the browser or a search engine or a user. So that's one of the important things there. But these structural elements are something that we're going to start to play with as we build pages. And so you're going to see that we're going to start to take the document and we're going to break it down just like that. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that to my page right now. I'm going to take the stuff that we created and I'm going to switch it over to this structure. So you're going to watch what I do here, okay? So I'm going to go back to the editor and I'm going to go full screen with it because I'm going to do a little bit of coding here for a little bit. All right, so Now, one thing that's very, very important, the header element is not the head, nor does it belong in the head. Now, last semester I had a number of people that maybe they didn't hear me correctly, or I don't know when they did their code, or maybe I didn't explain it so clearly, so I'm making a special point of it now, that the header tag has to be inside the body. And that's going to be one of the first things structurally on the page. So I'm going to create a header section, and then what am I going to put in my header? Well, chances are I'll probably put my navigation. Yeah, I won't put my navigation. I think I'm just going to put maybe the title of my page in the header. And really, you know what? I don't need like all these H1s, H2s, H3s. I'm just going to put an H1 inside there. And then I'm going to indent that. So my H1 tag, which is just text right now, but it's going to create the title for my site. And I'm not sure that that's what my site's going to be called at this point. I'll think of a theme later. Now, I did put this UL here at the beginning with intent earlier on because I was kind of starting to build a navigation section. And so this whole UL section, I'm going to indent inside there. Now, it's still just a UL, but now it has meaning in that it's attributed to the structural element of nav. I will also add at the very bottom, I'm going to add a footer. And for those of you watching the video and here in class, remember, if you're at home, you can pause the video if I'm going too fast. Because I have that tendency sometimes. So I'm taking that copyright thing at the bottom, and I'm putting it inside my footer. And, you know, the kind of stuff that I might put down there just depends on what I'm going to do, but that's going to be a separate, distinct section. Now think about this from one additional standpoint as you're working. When I'm working on a page structure, and I have a header and a nav and a footer, have you ever noticed that when you go to websites that typically those things don't change that much? So by also taking those things and putting them inside of a structure, I can also say that, well, when I build my other page, I can just take all this stuff up here at the top and just reuse it, right? Because it's the same. And it's easy to find because I've labeled it. See, it says nav. That's my nav. That's my header. So it's also kind of identifying that there's repeating elements on a page. And we're also kind of pointing out the fact that there are certain conventions that people use when they're putting pages together. When I learned how to code web pages, menus were a left-hand side thing. You put the menu on the left side of the screen. And then over the years, I'm not sure how, all of a sudden the menu is going across the top, horizontally, right? And think about it. When you go to a website, that's where you look, right? Once in a while, you look on the left, on the right, but typically your menu is at the top. There's a logo up there, some information, and then sometimes there's stuff at the bottom. And then there's also kind of the identification that we have an area in the middle where all the content goes. And here they're using a tag called main. So that's what I'm going to do next, is I'm going to create a little area here called main. All that stuff's going to go inside of it. Then I'm going to scroll all the way down, and then just above the footer, I'm going to close that main tag. Now what you might also want to do, and this is very optional, you see I'm highlighting all this text inside of main. I'm not even being precise about it. I'm just highlighting all the stuff in there, and I'm hitting my tab key, and I indented it once. Most good editors do that. So that also helps you just to see what sits inside of what else. So you can see your encapsulation, and that's really helpful. So I took the stuff that we already built. I added the header tag. I added the nav tag. I added the main. You can see that goes all the way down here, just above the footer. And then I did the footer. All that stuff is inside the body. And now I've taken my document and I've converted it to that structure. And once I have a structure like that, it also becomes really easy to style it. I mean, from an appearance standpoint, I want you guys to notice I just saved this. I'm going to go back to the browser and take a look at the result, wherever that is, right here. So here's the page before I hit refresh. You guys seeing it? Now I'm going to hit refresh. Well, the two H tags went away, but really it looks just the same. If I right-click and view source, which you should do, you can see the tags in action. Right, here's the main section. All the stuff I just did on the document. So now I have structured my page, and that is something you are going to get into the habit of doing if you haven't done it before. You may have done it maybe based on tutorials, but there's a reason why you do this structurally. I mean, there was no effect in the visual aspect of what that paragraph looked like, and that's because the footer tag, for example, doesn't have a style like H1 does where it makes it bigger and moves it over or does anything like that. It just gives it meaning. But now that I've given it meaning, I can code that section, I can make it do stuff, and I can style that section by putting a style on footer. And I can get everything that's in there. And that's called encapsulation, and that's a really important concept. All right, so that's a pretty important little section that we just went through. And there's a lot really to absorb there. So take it for what it's worth. If you need to reread it, you'll get this concept as we move forward because the structural elements will become more and more important as we start to build stuff. All right, let's move on to the next slide here. And we're going to talk about one of the most important tags in HTML, and it's really what kind of made HTML kind of take off, and that's the ability to link. And we call the core tag itself is called the anchor tag. So, for example, I'm going to find something on here that I can highlight. So let's say this word international. Oh, this is the, okay, we need the editor, not the view source. All right, here we go. So the core tag itself is the A tag. Okay, so that's what that looks like. But the A tag itself is never used on its own like that. It always requires an attribute, but it is called the anchor tag. So the way that we use an anchor tag is we apply what we call an attribute. So anything that you see inside a tag like this, and I'm going to just use empty quotes for right now, is called an attribute. So what you do is you get the name of whatever the property is, an equal sign, and then whatever value you're going to apply to it. Typically it's within quotes. Now, for an anchor tag, the href stands for hypertext reference, meaning what are we linking to? All right. So, for example, if I want to go to a website, I might do something like this. But notice if I'm going to a website, I do have to put in the HTTP. That's required for anything that's external. Now, that is where the anchor tag starts, and where will it end? I'm going to make it end here. I'm just going to put a closing anchor tag. So basically what's going to happen is the text that's encapsulated within those anchor tags, that's going to become the link. So I'm going to do Control S to save. I'm going to split screen myself here with the browser. And I'm going to do a right click, or excuse me, a Control R. And now you can see that that turned into a link that you should recognize. By default, an HTML5 browser will take a link and color it blue and underline it. When you hover over it, your pointer should change. And depending on your browser, You should also get a little hover. If you look down here in the corner of my browser, as I hover, you'll see that it shows the web address. Now, if I go ahead and click it, of course, you can already guess it's going to go to Yahoo. That's wonderful. But now when I go back, you'll also notice that that link changed from blue to purple, indicating that it is visited. That's a default style for HTML as well. We can control that, though, and we will learn how to do that in upcoming sessions. All right, so that's a real basic link, and this is to an external resource. So that's how you do that. Now, the anchor tags are cool because it kind of builds off that concept that Tim Berners-Lee was talking about in that video that we took a quick look at, which is the ability to link a concept to a resource, right? I don't know where Yahoo's stuff is located, on what server it's located, what its IP address is, what the document name is, any of that stuff. I'm just taking a snippet of text, and when I click on it, it takes me to a certain spot. So it jumps across the internet and finds that resource. That's a pretty amazing thing, really, especially when he developed it, because, you know, in that day you did have to know all those things to connect. So very important. Now, the interesting thing is that very often when we're using a hyperlink, we're not only going to connect to external stuff, like we just did here, we can connect to local things as well. So what I'm going to do here, just for the sake of example, is I'm going to take this web page that we're working on, and I'm going to make a copy of it. Okay? And I'm actually going to do that external to the program. I know I can do a save as, but I'm going to come here to where my folder is, where I'm storing my work in Unit 2. And I'm just going to do a right-click, copy, then right-click, paste. And then I'm going to come in here, I'm going to change that file name. First rule of thumb, no spaces. Okay? They're using the example of contact us. I'm going to do about. So I'm going to call my document about. And I know it's exactly like the page I have now. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take that page and I'm going to pull it into Notepad++, just drag and drop. And then I'm going to come in here, just so I know that I'm going to a different page. I'm going to change my title. And I know there's a bunch of gobbledygook on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to strip this way down and get rid of most of the content because I want it to be very apparent that I'm going to a different page. So I've created this simple about page. And just to repeat the steps I took, I made a copy of it. I renamed it. I brought it into Notepad++. I changed the title. I changed this H1 text, and I got rid of a lot of the stuff. Kept the footer the same. I kept the header the same and the nav the same. Really, the only stuff that's changing are the titles and what's inside the main tag. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my index page now. And you guys can probably already make a guess as to what I'm going to do here. I kind of have a primitive navigation forming already. So I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to put an anchor tag around this about text. And I'm actually going to create my double quotes and close them first so we don't get any confusion here. And now I'm inside here, I'm just simply going to say about.html, being mindful of the fact that in my folder window here, notice that it is all lowercase. Now, because the two files are in the same folder, that's all I have to do to link them together. So I'm going to test this. I'm going to do Control S to save. I'm going to go to my browser, and I'm going to reload my index page. Is this my index page? Yes. You know how I know? Because the link changed, right? And now if I hover over this and look at the address down at the bottom, notice how it points to About. I'm going to go ahead and click it, and it took me to my new page. And you can probably guess what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to take that link, right, that I created here, and then all the pages I'm going to create, I mean, they may as well have the same link, right? So I should probably also link back to the home page. So I'm going to do an href, and this one is going to link to index.html, all lowercase, of course, and close that anchor tag. And then I may as well put that on the home page too. Is it silly to link to itself? Well, hypothetically, I guess, but not going to break anything. I'll save that. I'll come back to my browser. I'm going to go ahead and just refresh the About page because now I have links to both, right? So now I can go to my home page, and I can go to my About page. And really, they're at different zoom levels. So this is at 100%. And then let's make that 100%. And then when you start creating consistent looking navigation, notice how it doesn't even seem to change much. All right, so we learned two really important linking techniques. One is to an external resource or website, right? In which case you need the full URL. I can't just do yahoo.com, that won't work. However, if it is a file that's local to your website, you just need to call the file directly, provided it's in the same folder. We will learn over the upcoming weeks that you can put files into different folders and how to navigate between them. But this is the most rudimentary form and really important conceptually. And this will be, I think, part of your second assignment there when you're building your pages. All right, let's move on to the next topic here. And this is one that you guys may have seen before, or maybe experienced before. I know some of you have coded, so that's why I say that. But here's one that's designed to be a mail link. So I'm going to do the same thing. And for me, where that makes sense is maybe down in the footer. So what I might do is I have a paragraph here, is copyright by me. So I might create another paragraph. Might even make the text small for all intents and purposes and say, feel free to email me and then I'll close the small tag and I'll close the paragraph. And then what I want to do is I want to make this the linkable text. So I'm just going to create right in front of email a href, and I want double quotes. I'm going to say mail to without a space, colon, and then whatever the email address is, you can just invent something, it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to close my anchor tag right here, right after the email me. So if you're going to look at this full screen, that's what it's going to look like. So this is going to be the linking text. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save this back to the browser. And this is on the home page. So you can see way at the bottom here how it's got an email me link. And watch what happens when I click on it. didn't take me somewhere on the web. It invoked my default email program. Now for me, I actually have an email program because I use Microsoft Outlook in conjunction with a lot of my webmail services. So when I click that Mail To button, it goes into like the system registry and says, oh, what's your email program? Oh, it's Outlook. Okay, let's launch Outlook. And notice what it did. It actually put in that email address and it's ready for you to type a message. Now here's the problem. Many people these days do not use email programs like Microsoft Outlook or Thunderbird or anything like that, or Mac Mail. A lot of people just use web-based mail like Yahoo and Gmail. The problem with that is when they click that Mail To link, you cannot predict it because a lot of times those webmail clients are not registered with the system. So when I click Mail To, it'll pop up a box and say, what program do you want me to use? I'm not sure what to do. You know, it gets confused. So that should be used with caution. And I will caution it even a little bit more by telling you that if you're going to use that technique, you might want to actually include your email address as the link. And really it should be the same email address that's inside here. Or provide it as plain text so that when the user sees it and then he runs into the situation where it's like, I don't know what to do, my email is not configured with my system, they can at least type it in. So for my money, I'm not a big fan of this approach, but it is something you should experiment and try. So once again, the code for it is regular href, but inside it says mail to, no spaces, a colon, and then the email address. Now whatever your text is that you're linking, and I think as a good rule of thumb, provide the email address as plain text so they don't have to go hunting for it. If you guys want to test that theory, create that code on the school machines here, or even if you're using your own machine, and then click that Mail To and see what happens. And you'll realize why that might not be a good choice for a user. All right, let's go to the next slide. And what they're asking us to do here at the conclusion of the chapter is to kind of do what we were doing with the home and the about page. And you might want to practice that by really creating pages around a theme, like you're going to kind of build towards your website project, or at least practice, where you're going to have a structure where you're linking between the pages. So what we basically did is we had a home and an about, but you might come up with a number of different pages, and you can work with the menu structure. And in this case, I'm using an unordered list. And you could add a third page called contact, or whatever you want to call it, and then practice getting them linking to each other, and you'll get that concept down. In the subsequent weeks when we start messing with this page structure, and I'm basically going to be taking this and I'm just going to keep building it, we'll look at a little bit more sophisticated techniques and how to lay out navigation using a couple of different approaches. But that really kind of covers all the key concepts here in this chapter. And we did it, I think, in a pretty efficient amount of time. So this video is done, and then we'll answer any questions you have here in class and play with code.